Hello, and welcome to Silent Science. Tonight, we're setting off on a journey through the long, winding road of human healing, from ancient bone drills to the gentle hum of modern machines. This is the science of sickness, the history of human healing, a story of trial, error, hope, and a surprising number of herbs. Now, this video is designed to help you unwind, maybe even drift off to sleep. So I do hope it's relaxing enough to send you gently into dreamland. But if you happen to stay awake because it's just that interesting, well, at least you'll be falling asleep a little wiser. That's not such a bad trade, is it? Before we dive in, I'd love it if you could tap that like button. And if you're enjoying these sleepy science stories, consider subscribing. It helps this little corner of the universe grow. I'd also love to know where in the world you're listening from, and what time it is as you're tuning in. Is it the middle of the night, just before bed, or maybe a sneaky midday nap? Let me know in the comments. I always read them, and it's such a delight seeing this sleepy community stretching across the globe. Now, let's get comfortable. Maybe you're tucked in under a warm blanket, or the room is dim with just the faintest flicker of light. Wherever you are, and however you're listening, this is your time to slow down, take a deep breath, let the day go on. Prepare to explore how humans have faced sickness, from the superstitious to the scientific, and everything in between. And, of course, while we're talking all about the history of medicine, please remember nothing in this video is medical advice. Always speak to a qualified professional if you're feeling unwell. Alright, ready? Let's begin. The dawn of healing, long before the hum of hospital machines and the comforting scent of antiseptic wipes. Long before x-rays or stethoscopes or even written language, humans still got sick. And when they did, they didn't just shrug and accept it. No, they tried to get better. In the prehistoric world, healing was already an art, a mystery. Sometimes a bit of a performance, but always. It mattered deeply. We don't have any Neolithic medical journals lying around, no cave walls helpfully labeled day 1 of fever, prescribed boiled moss. But what we do have are bones, tools and clues left behind by early humans, whispering a story of ingenuity, trial and error, and more than a little magic. Let's start with one of the most striking medical mysteries of the Stone Age. If you've never heard of it, imagine this: a person thousands of years ago with a hole carefully cut into their skull. Not smashed, not fractured, deliberately carved. And here's the fascinating part. Many of those skulls show signs of healing, which means the person survived the procedure. Trepanation is the oldest known surgical practice. Archaeologists have found trepanned skulls all over the world, from France to Peru to Siberia, some as old as 7,000 years. That's older than the Great Pyramids, older than Stonehenge. It's one of the few things our ancestors seem to agree. And even across continents, sometimes you just need to open up the skull and let something out. But why? Why would someone take a flint tool and carefully scrape a hole into another person's head? One theory is medical. Maybe they were treating head trauma, a blow to the skull from a fall, a fight, or the occasional wild animal encounter. Trepanation might have relieved pressure from swelling or let out pooled blood. In that case, it's not so far off from modern treatments for severe brain injuries. So though our tools today are admittedly a bit more sterile, another theory leans more spiritual. Some researchers think trepanation was meant to release evil spirits or bad energy from the body. After all, if someone was behaving strangely, maybe having seizures, intense headaches, or a mental illness, it would have seemed like possession, a curse, or a punishment from the gods. In that context, drilling a hole to let it out feels eerily logical, painful, but logical. It wasn't all skull surgery, though. Much of prehistoric medicine was rooted in the natural world. Plants weren't just food, they were medicine cabinets. Archaeologists have found traces of medicinal herbs buried with prehistoric people such as yarrow and chamomile, plants still used in herbal teas today. Imagine a time when healing meant walking into the forest, looking for the right leaf, root, or mushroom and hoping you picked the one that healed instead of the one that didn't. Interestingly, there's evidence that even Neanderthals may have used medicinal plants. In one case, plaques scraped from a Neanderthal's teeth revealed traces of poplar, which contains salicylic acid, the active ingredient in aspirinas, well as a mold with natural antibiotic properties. Was this just coincidence, or did our distant cousins know what they were doing? It's hard to say, but the idea that ancient people were experimenting with natural painkillers thousands of years before modern pharmacology is kind of mind-blowing. And then there were the shamans, original healthcare providers, spiritual leaders, and part-time pharmacists. Every community likely had someone who held the sacred knowledge, how to soothe a fever, which chants to sing, which smoke to blow over the wound, and when to call upon the ancestors for help. Healing was as much a ritual as it was a remedy. In some cultures, shamans would enter trance-like states, often with the help of hallucinogenic plants, and communicate with the spirit world to diagnose illness. The lines between medicine, religion, and performance blurred, and maybe that blurring helped. If someone believed they were being healed, that belief alone might have eased their symptoms. Placebo effect, maybe, or just the power of hope. Dressed in feathers and bone necklaces, clothing, tools, and even the settings of these rituals likely played a role in their effectiveness. If you've ever been comforted just by walking into a calm, quiet doctor's office with soft lighting and a soothing voice, imagine how reassuring it might have felt to see your village healer swaying to the beat of a drum, surrounded by aromatic herbs and glowing embers, declaring that your pain was being banished by the spirits. It wasn't evidence-based exactly, but it was deeply human. We often think of prehistoric life as brutish and short, and to be fair, the average lifespan wasn't particularly long, but that doesn't mean people didn't care for each other. Some archaeological finds show individuals with severe injuries or disabilities who lived for years with the help of their communities. Someone fed them, protected them, and helped them heal even when the science was shaky. The care was there. We also find primitive splints made from bark and animal hide, suggesting broken bones were set and immobilized. They were likely made from crushed plants used to soothe wounds or reduce swelling. Burned areas might have been treated with cool mud, insect bites with plant resins, fevers with shade and water. Always observation. If a treatment seemed to help, it might be passed on. If it didn't, well, perhaps the spirits were blamed. And this is where we see the roots of what would eventually become medicine as we know it's in observation, trial, memory, and care. Imagine two early humans sitting by a fire. One has a nasty gash, and the other is gently pressing chewed leaves into the wound. Tomorrow, if the bleeding stops, they'll remember that plant. And if it doesn't, they might try something else, or pray a little harder next time. Of course, many of these methods wouldn't pass modern clinical trials, but some turned out to be surprisingly effective. Willow bark, long used in ancient cultures to treat pain and fever, led to the development of aspirin. Moldy bread used on wounds hinted at the antibacterial power of penicillin. Even honey, used by early humans to dress wounds, has genuine antimicrobial properties. It's humbling to realize that even in the distant past, people were paying attention, not just surviving, but learning. From the shadows of caves to the clearing of a forest, humans watched, experimented, and remembered. Medicine didn't begin in a lab, it began in the quiet moments after an injury, in the concerned gaze of a mother, in the practiced hands of a healer, in the trust between one person and another trying to help. So the next time you take a painkiller, or sip some tea for a sore throat. You're participating in a story that began thousands of years ago with a handful of herbs, a few sharp stones, and a whole lot of guesswork. And maybe a hole or two in the head. The rise of ancient Egyptian medicine. If there's one civilization that knew how to make a grand statement in stone, in story, and in medicine, it was ancient Egypt. Pyramids soared, gods multiplied, and even sickness had style. While the modern world might think of ancient Egyptian medicine as mummies and maybe the occasional cursed tomb, the reality was far more sophisticated for its time. Egyptian healing was remarkably advanced, a heady mix of natural remedies, spiritual belief, and good old-fashioned observation. Let's start with a name, Imhotep. He wasn't just a wise man or a priest. He's often regarded as the world's first named physician, living over 4,000 years ago during the Third Dynasty. Imhotep served as an architect, a high priest, a scholar, and a healer. In fact, he was later deified, worshipped as the god of medicine. Imagine your local general practitioner being elevated to divine status, complete with temples, statues, and incense. Quite a resume. Egyptian medicine was closely tied to religion and the belief that the gods played a direct role in human health. Each organ, each ailment, had divine associations. The goddess Sekhmet, lion-headed and fierce, was linked to plagues and healing. Thoth, the ibis-headed god of wisdom, was said to grant knowledge of medicine. Even Isis, one of the most revered deities, was seen as a protector of the sick. Healing wasn't just physical, it was cosmic. But that doesn't mean the Egyptians relied only on prayers and statues. They wrote things down, and thank goodness they did. One of the most famous medical texts from ancient Egypt is the Ebers Papyrus, dating back to around 1500 BC. That's more than 3,500 years ago. This scroll, over 60 feet long, is essentially a comprehensive medical manual. Inside are hundreds of remedies, spells, diagnoses, and surgical procedures. It includes advice for everything from setting fractures to treating hair loss to warding off evil spirits. Sometimes those were the same treatment. Some of the remedies were surprisingly reasonable. For example, honey was used to treat wounds. Practice we now know has genuine antibacterial properties. Garlic and onions were prescribed for infections and circulatory problems. They even described what we'd now recognize as asthma, prescribing a mixture of herbs heated on bricks to create medicinal steam. Essentially the ancient version of an inhaler. But not every treatment has aged so gracefully. Take, for instance, the use of crocodile dung as a contraceptive ingredient, or the frequent appearance of excrement of various origins in their prescriptions. It's a reminder that even when you're on the cutting edge of ancient science, sometimes things get a bit weird still. For all the odd ingredients, Egyptian medicine had structure. They believed in a concept called the medshu, which referred to channels running through the body, a bit like blood vessels, nerves, and airways all rolled into one. If these channels were blocked or disturbed, illness followed. The idea was that the heart was the control center, sending life through these pathways. Sound familiar? It's not far from the later understanding of the circulatory system to keep the medshu clear. Doctors employed a variety of treatments, massages, herbal infusions, laxatives, and of course, spells. It was all about restoring balance, not unlike traditional Chinese medicine or Ayurvedic principles. In fact, many ancient healing systems shared a common goal: balance within the body, often mirrored by harmony in the universe. Who were the doctors, exactly? In ancient Egypt, medicine was a respected profession. Physicians trained in temple schools, particularly those attached to the god Thoth. They specialized, some focused on internal diseases, others on wounds, dentistry, or even specific organs. There were shepherds of the anus, proctologists, essentially mentioned in records with all due seriousness. There were even female doctors, like Perseus, who lived around 2400 BCE and held the title Lady Overseer of the Female Physicians. So not only did Egypt have doctors, it had medical administrations take that bureaucracy. Surgical tools have also been discovered in tombs and temples, made of copper or bronze, scalpels, forceps, and even early forms of clamps. Of course, there was no anesthesia in the modern sense, but they may have used plant extracts with sedative properties, like mandrake or opium poppy, to dull pain. There are also depictions of wound cleaning, stitching, and splinting. Hygiene wasn't a footnote, it was a crucial part of care. And what about those famous mummies? Oddly enough, embalming provided an unusual sort of anatomy education. Although religious taboos often limited dissection of the living, embalmers knew quite a bit about internal organs, where they were, how to remove them, and what they looked like. It's likely that this knowledge fed into medical understanding if it wasn't formalized. Picture an embalmer whispering trade secrets to a physician over dinner. Public health also mattered. Cleanliness was emphasized in religious rituals, which spilled over into daily life. Egyptians bathed regularly, shaved their heads to prevent lice, and used scented oils to keep skin supple and bug-free. They even had rudimentary toothpaste made from ground rock salt and herb sand. Although their dentistry left much to be desired, chewing on sand-covered grain wore teeth down. They at least noticed when something was wrong. Many mummies show signs of abscesses, cavities, and dental interventions. Mental health wasn't ignored either. The ancient Egyptians believed the heart housed thoughts and emotions, not the brain, which they considered more of a skull filler than anything useful. But they still documented symptoms like depression, anxiety, and hallucinations, often linking them to spiritual imbalances or divine punishment. Treatments ranged from soothing baths and incense to ritual cleansing and protective amulets. Speaking of amulets, magical objects played a big role in healing. The famous Eye of Horus symbol, for example, was worn for protection and believed to promote health and ward off evil. There were chants, incantations, and spells for nearly every ailment, from snake bites to nightmares. Even if the remedies didn't always work, the rituals themselves may have provided comfort and reassurance. And as any doctor will tell you, reassurance is half the battle. The truth is, for a civilization that thrived thousands of years ago, ancient Egypt had an impressive grasp of medical practice. Their healers combined spiritual beliefs with systematic treatments, recorded their findings, trained their successes, and laid the groundwork for generations of medical advancement. Sure, there were missteps done, remember, but there was also discovery, empathy, and a real desire to understand the human body. So the next time you visit a doctor or sip a cup of chamomile tea to calm your nerves, give a little nod to the ancient Egyptians. They might not have had germ theory, but they knew that health mattered. They believed in balance, in care, and in the idea that healing wasn't just about the body, it was about the soul too. And really, isn't that what we're all still trying to figure out? The birth of rational medicine in ancient Greece, ancient Egypt, brought structure and ritual to medicine. Ancient Greece brought curiosity, restless, question-filled hunger to understand, not just how the body worked, but why. In the streets of Athens, in the temples of Asclepius, in scroll-filled libraries, and on windswept island shores, Greek thinkers and physicians laid the philosophical foundations of Western medicine. Some of their ideas endured for millennia, others less so. But even their wrong turns were driven by a sincere attempt to make sense of sickness. Through reason and observation, not just divine intervention. At the center of it all was a man named Hippocrates, the so-called father of medicine. Now, Hippocrates didn't invent healing, nor was he the only doctor of his time. But what he did do was change the way people thought about it. Living on the island of Kos around the 5th century BCE, over 2,400 years ago, Hippocrates believed that illness wasn't a punishment from the gods. It wasn't some mystical plague hurled from Mount Olympus after an especially disappointing offering of olives. No, he argued that disease came from natural causes, and, more importantly, that it could be studied, understood, and treated with skill rather than superstition. This was a radical idea. Imagine living in a world where epilepsy was seen as divine possession, or where a sneeze might be interpreted as an omen from Zeus. To say, "Actually, I think it might be your liver," required a bold shift in thinking, and that's exactly what Hippocrates offered. He and his followers recorded observations, tracked symptoms, and searched for patterns. Their goal was to create a system, a rationale, repeatable way to understand health. It wasn't perfect, but it was a start. One of the most influential concepts to come from Hippocratic thinking was the theory of the four humors. If you've ever heard someone described as melancholic or sanguine, you're hearing echoes of this ancient framework. According to the theory, the human body was governed by IV fluids: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Each humor was linked to particular organs, elements, and even personality traits. Blood associated with the heart and the element of air was thought to make a person cheerful and social, the sanguine type. Phlegm, linked to the brain and water, made people calm and sluggish, the phlegmatic temperament. Yellow bile, tied to the liver and fire, produced ambition and anger, the choleric personality. And black bile, connected to the spleen and earth, brought introspection and sadness, the melancholic disposition. Good health, the Greeks believed, came from a balance of these humors. Too much or too little of anyone could cause both illness and emotional imbalance. You weren't just sick, you were out of tune with yourself and with nature. So how did Greek doctors restore balance? With a wide-ranging toolbox. There were dietary adjustments. Different foods encouraged or suppressed different humors. If you were too hot and dry, perhaps from an excess of yellow bile, you might be prescribed cool, moist vegetables, or even a relaxing bath. If you were sluggish from too much phlegm, maybe a spicy soup or some vigorous exercise was in order. And then there was bloodletting, the practice of removing blood to rebalance the system. It sounds alarming now, but for centuries it was seen as a rational, even gentle intervention. If you had a fever, it was assumed you had too much blood, so out it went. Bloodletting continued well into the Renaissance and beyond, with leeches and lancets a regular part of the physician's kit, all thanks in part to those early Greek theories. It's easy to chuckle at the humors today, but for their time, they represented a significant leap. They offered a model, one that moved away from divine punishment and toward natural explanation. It was a way to say, let's study what we can see and feel instead of guessing what the gods might be thinking. Greek medicine didn't just live in dusty scrolls, was practiced in Asclepians, healing temples dedicated to Asclepius, the god of medicine. People would travel for miles to seek treatment. Upon arrival, they might fast, bathe, and offer gifts. Then came the most important part: incubation, a ritual in which the patient slept inside the temple, hoping to receive a healing dream from the god himself. In the morning, priests would interpret these dreams and prescribe treatment accordingly. While that may sound more spiritual than scientific, these temples also functioned as early hospitals. They were clean, tranquil, and organized. Patients received care, rest, and what we'd now call supportive therapy. In some cases, they even underwent surgeries, though the more complex procedures were left to skilled practitioners outside the temples. Greek physicians, including Hippocrates and his successors, also began keeping case histories. These were detailed notes on a patient's condition, symptoms, treatments, and outcomes. There was the beginning of the medical charter, big step toward evidence-based care. Then there were the medical texts, the Hippocratic Corpus, a collection of over 60 treatises attributed to Hippocrates and his followers. It covered everything, from fractures to fevers. Not all of it was consistent, and much of it was written over generations. But the central theme remained. Medicine should be grounded in observation and logic. One text even includes a guide for ethical behavior, how physicians should conduct themselves. This eventually evolved into the Hippocratic Oath, which many modern doctors still reference in ceremonial form. Do no harm, the famous phrase, though not directly from Hippocrates, himself embodies the spirit of careful, thoughtful medicine. Other Greek thinkers built on this foundation. Aristotle, the great philosopher, delved into anatomy and biology. He classified animals and studied reproduction. He believed in empirical study, watching, recording, and testing ideas. His work would influence scientists for centuries even when he was a bit off base. He thought the brain was a cooling mechanism for the heart, which points for effort. Another giant of Greek medicine was Herophilos. Working in Alexandria around 300 BCE, he performed human dissections, controversial, and rare practice, and described the nervous system with surprising accuracy. He distinguished between arteries and veins, and even identified the optic nerve. His contemporary Erasistratus explored the brain and proposed that nerves carried pneumata, or vital spirit, not quite right, but tantalizingly close to understanding. The nervous system. Of course, it wasn't all breakthroughs. Greek medicine had its share of misunderstandings. For instance, some doctors believed that wombs could wander through the body, causing hysteria. This belief persisted for centuries and led to some rather peculiar treatments involving fragrant oils and stern advice. It's a reminder that even the most rational minds can take wrong turns when information is limited. Still, the overall spirit of Greek medicine, inquiry, observation, ethics, was revolutionary. It treated the body as something to be understood rather than feared. It gave future generations a framework to build on and, perhaps most importantly, it placed healing in the hands of human beings, not just the whims of the gods. In many ways, the ancient Greeks gave medicine its first philosophy. They weren't content to treat symptoms, they wanted to understand causes. They searched for patterns in fever, in breath, in pain. They asked questions, tested theories, and wrote things down. They made mistakes, yes, but they cared about the answers. So when we think about medicine today, its science, its structure, its ethics, we're seeing reflections of a world that began over 2,000 years ago, where thinkers in togas looked up from their scrolls and asked, what if there's a reason for all of this? And in asking, they lit a spark that's still burning. The practical precision of Roman medicine. By the time ancient Rome rose to power, medicine had already come a long way from prehistoric rituals and spiritual chants to Hippocratic logic and the theory of humus. But the Romans, ever practical, ever organized, took what came before them and gave it a distinctly Roman polish. Greek medicine may have been the soul of the system, but Roman medicine was its muscle. It was robust, efficient, sometimes brutal, and often surprisingly effective, especially if you were lucky enough to be a citizen and not, say, a wounded gladiator. Let's begin with Galen, perhaps the most influential physician in Roman history. Born in Pergamon, in what is now Turkey, around 129 CE, Galen trained in medicine and philosophy before making his way to Rome, where he became the personal physician to several emperors. He was a prolific writer, a brilliant anatomist, and a man with very strong opinions, most of which he recorded in hundreds of treatises. Some of his medical texts would remain authoritative for more than 1,000 years. Galen was heavily influenced by Greek thinkers like Hippocrates, but he added his own flair. He believed in the four humors, but he also emphasized the importance of anatomy, dissection, and physiological understanding. Unfortunately, he was rarely allowed to dissect human bodies. That was frowned upon in Roman society, so he turned to animals, pigs, and monkeys mostly. While this led to some anatomical errors, he thought humans had a bone in their heart. They don't. It also gave him detailed insights into the workings of muscles, nerves, and organs. But Galen was only one part of a much broader system. Roman medicine was heavily integrated into everyday life, especially when it came to public health. This is where the Romans really shone. They built aqueducts that transported clean water over great distances, some of which are still standing. Today, they constructed elaborate sewage systems, including the Cloaca Maxima, or Great Drain, which kept the streets of Rome far cleaner than most medieval cities would be over 1,000 years later. Public baths were everywhere, not just for hygiene, but for relaxation and socializing. Romans were encouraged to bathe daily, scrape their skin with a strigil, and enjoy a soak in hot, warm, and cold pools. It wasn't just luxury, it was considered part of a healthy routine. They also emphasized air quality. Roman engineers paid close attention to ventilation in buildings and believed in the importance of fresh air and sunshine. While they didn't yet know about microbes, they were deeply concerned with what they called miasma badarand. They did everything they could to avoid it. Many of their practices, while based on incorrect theories, ended up reducing disease transmission simply through better sanitation. The military also played a significant role in advancing Roman medical practice. The Roman army wasn't just a fearsome fighting machine, it was an early engine of medical innovation. Field medicine was a necessity. Soldiers needed to be patched up quickly and efficiently, and so military doctors developed techniques to clean wounds, set bones, and amputate limbs when necessary. Roman military hospitals called valetudinaria were set up near forts and battlefields. These facilities had separate wards, sanitation systems, and even written records remarkably close in structure to modern hospitals. Surgical tools from Roman times, many of which have been recovered from archaeological sites, reveal a level of sophistication that might surprise you. Forceps, scalpels, probes, and even early versions of catheters and speculums were made from bronze and iron. The fact that many of these tools closely resemble modern equivalents is a testament to their thoughtful designer, the unfortunate consistency of the human body over the centuries. One of the more harrowing aspects of Roman medicine was its role in gladiator care. Gladiators were investments, expensive, well-fed, and trained for years. If one got injured in the arena, owners didn't just let them die. They brought in Medici doctors who specialized in trauma medicine. These physicians gained valuable experience in treating stab wounds, fractures, and deep lacerations. In a strange and rather grim way, the gladiatorial games helped improve the science of surgery. Roman medicine also had its folk side. Not every Roman citizen had access to Galen or military hospitals. Many relied on herbal remedies, midwives, and healers. Herbalism was common, drawing from native plants as well as exotic imports brought in through Roman trade networks. Ingredients like myrrh, opium poppy, garlic, and vinegar were widely used for treating everything from infections to insomnia. Vinegar, in particular, deserves a mention. Roman soldiers carried posca, a mixture of vinegar and water, which they believed to be refreshing and healthful. It was mildly antibacterial and may have helped prevent waterborne illnesses. For wounds, vinegar was applied directly as a disinfectant, an ancient precursor to antiseptics. Painful, yes, but sometimes effective. Midwives or obstetresses played a crucial role in childbirth and women's health. They weren't just birthing assistants. They had knowledge of herbal remedies, massage, and even minor surgical procedures. Some worked independently, while others were attached to wealthy households. Pregnancy and childbirth were dangerous, and the maternal mortality rate was high, but midwives were a vital part of the safety net. Spirituality and superstition were never far away. The Romans, like most ancient peoples, believed in a wide pantheon of gods and spirits that influenced health. Shrines to Asclepius were common, and people left offerings in hopes of healing. Protective amulets were worn, especially by children and pregnant women. There were also household godslayeries, who were thought to guard the family's well-being. A little prayer, a little olive oil, and perhaps a strategically placed chicken bone could go a long way in the ancient Roman mind. One particularly fascinating practice was dream incubation. Much like in Greece, some Romans believed that dreams could reveal the cause of an illness or offer a cure. Patients would sleep in sacred spaces, hoping to receive visions that could guide their treatment. While not exactly peer-reviewed, it's hard to argue with the appeal of solving your health problems with a well-timed nap. Despite all their advancements, Romans were still working with a limited knowledge base. They didn't understand bacteria or viruses, and their surgeries were performed without anesthesia beyond alcohol, opium, or herbal sedatives. There were no antibiotics, and infection was a constant risk. That said, their pragmatism, organization, and emphasis on hygiene gave them a surprising edge over many later societies. In many ways, Roman medicine was a paradox grounded in Greek theory, shaped by religion, yet also incredibly forward-thinking. They built systems, created infrastructure, kept records, improved sanitation, and emphasized prevention. And while some of their ideas were off the mark, like Galen's insistence on humor as their overall approach was a crucial step forward in the long history of human healing. So if you ever find yourself marveling at running water, soap, or that neatly folded hospital gown, remember that somewhere deep in the annals of time, a Roman engineer and a Roman doctor probably had something to do with it. And they'd probably be quite pleased to know that their ideas and maybe even a few of their tools are still in use today. 2,000 years later, the golden age of Islamic medicine, as the Roman Empire faded and Europe entered the early medieval period. Much of the classical world's medical knowledge slipped into obscurity, preserved here and there in dusty monasteries and fading scrolls, but often overshadowed by more immediate concerns, like not getting trampled by invaders. But while Europe wrestled with instability, something remarkable was happening in the Islamic world. From the 7th to the 13th centuries, the Islamic Golden Age flourished, and with it, medicine. This chapter of healing history isn't just a story about hospitals and herbs. It's about translation, synthesis, and the fearless pursuit of knowledge. The Islamic world took the best of Greek, Roman, Persian, Indian, and even Chinese medicine, wove it together with original insights, and created something new, something deeply rational, surprisingly modern, and incredibly influential. It all began with a profound appreciation for learning. The Prophet Muhammad himself encouraged the seeking of knowledge, and early Islamic leaders took this to heart. Across the vast and diverse territories of the Islamic caliphates, scholars began collecting texts from every corner of the known world. Greek medical works, including those of Hippocrates and Galen, were translated into Arabic, often with detailed commentaries and corrections. These translations weren't just linguistic exercises. They were acts of preservation, refinement, and innovation. One of the intellectual epicenters of this movement was the House of Wisdom in Baghdad, established in the early 9th century. This grand academy was a beacon of scholarship, where Muslim, Christian, and Jewish scholars worked side by side, translating texts debating theories, and experimenting with treatments. Medicine, astronomy, mathematics, and philosophy all found fertile ground. It was quite literally a golden age for curious minds. From this intellectual soil grew some of history's most brilliant medical minds. Take Al-Razi, known in the West as Razes, born in Persia in the 9th century. He was a physician, philosopher, chemist, and all-around polymath. He was among the first to clearly distinguish between smallpox and measles, two diseases that were often confused. His clinical descriptions of these illnesses were so precise that they remained authoritative for centuries. His magnum opus, Kitab al-Harwi, or the Comprehensive Book, was an enormous medical encyclopedia that drew from Greek, Indian, and Arabic sources, as well as Al-Razi's own observations. Al-Razi was also deeply interested in ethics. He believed that physicians should treat rich and poor alike, and that medicine was both a science and a moral duty. He emphasized evidence over tradition, but because he disliked tradition, but because he believed knowledge should always be tested against reality. If a treatment didn't work, it didn't matter how ancient it was. Then there was Ibn Sina, better known in Europe as Avicenna, born in the 10th century in what is now Uzbekistan. Avicenna was another towering figure in the history of medicine. By the age of 16, he was already treating patients. By 21, he had written numerous medical treatises, and by his mid-40s, he completed one of the most influential medical texts in history, the Canon of Medicine. The Canon wasn't just a book, it was the book. For centuries, it was the standard medical textbook in Europe, written in Arabic and later translated into Latin. It became a staple in European medical schools all the way into the 17th century. It laid out a structured approach to diagnosis and treatment, emphasized the importance of hygiene, diet, and exercise, and catalogued hundreds of drugs and remedies. Avicenna's emphasis on reason and observation helped push medicine further into the realm of science and out of the shadows of superstition. Importantly, Islamic medicine emphasized the holistic nature of health. Physical, mental, and spiritual well-being were seen as interconnected. Physicians were expected to be learned, not just in biology, but in ethics, philosophy, and psychology. The patient wasn't just a malfunctioning machine, they were a soul, a mind, a body, and a story. This philosophy was reflected in the creation of hospitals. The Islamic world didn't invent hospitals, but it refined and expanded them dramatically. Take the Bimaristan, a Persian term that literally means house of the sick. These hospitals weren't just places to rest, they were centers for medical treatment, education, and even research. By the 9th century, large urban hospitals were being built in cities like Baghdad, Damascus, and Cairo. They had separate wards for different conditions, pharmacies, lecture halls, libraries, and gardens. Some even offered music therapy and fresh air walks as part of recovery. And here's a pleasant surprise. Treatment was often free of charge, funded by charitable endowments known as WAQF. One of the most famous of these hospitals was the Ahmed ibn Tulun Hospital in Cairo, established in the 9th century. It offered care for men and women, treated mental health conditions alongside physical ones, and employed a wide array of physicians, nurses, and support staff. Patients were treated with dignity and, upon recovery, were sometimes given money to help them return to normal life. Mental health care, in particular, was treated with a compassion rarely seen in other parts of the world at the time. Rather than imprisoning or ostracizing people with mental illness, many Islamic hospitals offered treatments rooted in both medicine and empathy. Music, baths, conversation, and compassionate care were all part of the process. Pharmacology also advanced dramatically. Islamic physicians and apothecaries compiled detailed pharmacopoeias, books of drugs and their uses, many of which were translated and used in Europe for centuries. They experimented with distillation, sublimation, and extraction methods, paving the way for later developments in chemistry. Drugs were measured carefully, mixed with precision, and prescribed based on symptoms, not just hunches. Among the many substances used were camphor, rosewater, sandalwood, cinnamon, opium, and mercury, though, as always, some ingredients were more helpful than others. There were syrups for coughs, ointments for wounds, and elixirs for digestion. The humble sugar pill made its appearance, sometimes with a hint of honey or rose essence to make the medicine go down. Far more pleasant than crocodile dung. At any rate, of course, Islamic medicine wasn't perfect. It still operated under the framework of the four humors, and superstition sometimes crept in alongside scientific observation. But overall, it represented a profound step forward. It was rigorous, compassionate, and global in scope. Perhaps most importantly, it was shared. The Islamic world served as a bridge between East and West, preserving Greek and Roman medical knowledge, enhancing it with ideas from India and Persia, and eventually passing it back to Europe through translations into Latin and Hebrew. Without this transmission of knowledge, the Renaissance might have bloomed much later or differently altogether. So when you think of medicine's long and winding journey, don't forget this shimmering chapter in the Middle East and North Africa time, when healing wasn't just a profession, but a calling. When hospitals opened their doors to the rich and the poor. When books were written not just to preserve knowledge, but to spread it. And when the act of healing, precise, thoughtful, and deeply humane, became one of the noblest pursuits in the world. Medieval medicine. Between faith and folk remedies, picture a flickering candle in a stone chamber, shelves lined with scrolls. A hunched figure in a brown robe grinding herbs with a mortar and pestle while outside. The wind howls through a grim and chilly landscape. Welcome to medieval Europe, where the line between medicine and mysticism was thinner than a leech's patience, and healing could mean anything. From a soothing herbal tea to the enthusiastic application of hot irons, the fall of the Roman Empire in the 5th century plunged much of Europe into what many once called the Dark Ages, though that term has fallen out of favor among historians. It wasn't so much darkness as it was a great shifting political chaos. Economic hardship and crumbling infrastructure meant that the scientific rigor of earlier civilizations gave way to more localized, spiritual, and often improvisational approaches to health. Medicine didn't disappear, but it certainly got creative. In this world, monasteries became unlikely centers of healing. Monks, especially those in Benedictine orders, took seriously their duty to care for the sick. These monastic communities preserved and copied ancient medical texts, cultivated herb gardens, and provided care to both their brothers and, in some cases, local lay people. The herbarium, a carefully tended garden of medicinal plants, was as important as the chapel. Monks grew sage, rosemary, lavender, comfrey, and other plants believed to aid digestion, reduce fevers, and heal wounds. Many of these plants had genuine medicinal properties. For example, willow bark used to relieve pain and inflammation contains splastin, a precursor to aspirin. St. John's wort was used to treat melancholy, a medieval term for what we might now recognize as depression. It's still used today in some herbal remedies. So while the chanting and incense may have been symbolic, the garden had teeth, or at least leaves. Monks also created leech books, manuals of medical knowledge and remedies, which combined empirical observations with spiritual elements. These texts included prayers and charms alongside treatments, reflecting the deeply intertwined relationship between medicine and faith. Illness was seen as a test, a punishment, or a sign from God. Healing, in turn, was both a physical and a spiritual endeavor. One particularly popular treatment was bloodletting, based on the ancient Greek theory of the four humours: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. It was believed that an imbalance of these fluids caused illness. Too much blood, let it out. The preferred method: leeches, knives, or lancets, often applied according to astrological charts. Yes, even the stars got involved. It was considered unwise to bleed someone during certain moon phases, or when specific planets were in the wrong part of the sky. Imagine your doctor saying, "We'll schedule your procedure after Mercury retrograde." Astrology, in fact, was an essential part of medieval medical practice. Physicians carried zodiac mannequins, little diagrams showing which body parts corresponded to which astrological signs. Aries ruled the head, Taurus the neck, Gemini the arms, and so on. Treatments were often timed to match the stars, and horoscopes might be drawn up to diagnose disease. Was it scientifically rigorous? No. Was it sincere? Absolutely. In an unpredictable world, astrology offered a sense of order, a cosmic calendar. For the chaos of illness, outside the monastery, folk medicine flourished. Most common people couldn't read, let alone access ancient texts or visit a physician trained at university. Instead, they turned to wise women, cunning folk, and local healers who used generational knowledge passed down through word of mouth. These healers knew which herbs could soothe a cough, how to set a broken bone with splints, and how to mix poultices for wounds. Their work was practical, hands-on, and deeply rooted in the rhythms of the land. But it wasn't without risk. During periods of religious or social panic, folk healers, especially women, were sometimes accused of witchcraft. The same woman who one day helped deliver a baby might the next be accused of consorting with demons if something went wrong. Still, in many communities, these healers were respected, even revered. After all, they were the ones who showed up when your child had a fever, or your leg was swollen after a run-in with a wild boar. As for hospitals, they did exist in medieval Europe, but they bore little resemblance to modern institutions. Often attached to monasteries or religious orders, they were more like places of shelter and hospice care than medical centers. Patients might receive food, rest, and prayer. There might be a herbalist or nurse, but complex treatments were rare. Hospitals were primarily places to comfort, not to cure. One of the most widely known orders was the Order of St. John, which operated hospitals for pilgrims traveling to the Holy Land. In cities like Paris and London, hospitals began to emerge. By the 12th century, providing care for the poor, the elderly, and the chronically ill. These institutions were often funded by nobles or clergy, who hoped that generosity might earn them a few extra points in the afterlife. For more advanced medical treatment, one had to turn to a university-trained physician. From the 12th century onward, medical schools began to flourish in cities like Salerno, Montpellier, and Bologna. These universities offered formal medical education, though the curriculum was still heavily based on Galenic texts and the writings of Islamic scholars like Avicenna. Students learned anatomy through books. Body's dissection was rare and sometimes forbidden. Despite this, the emergence of academic medicine marked a turning point. Healing was now a learned profession, not just a craft. Physicians would diagnose illness through careful observation of symptoms, examination of urine. Yes, medieval doctors were absolutely obsessed with urine, and long interviews with the patient. The color, smell, and even taste of urine were believed to reveal much about the body's internal state. A well-educated physician might carry a urine wheel, a circular chart displaying shades from pale yellow to ominous brown, each linked to specific conditions. It was, in its own way, a very early form of laboratory testing, just a bit more pungent. One of the most feared ailments of the time was leprosy. Those diagnosed with it were often shunned or forced to live in leper. colonies sometimes even given a symbolic funeral to declare them legally dead. In truth, many of these cases likely weren't leprosy as we define it today. Some were other skin conditions or illnesses that produced visible sores, but the fear was real and the stigma intense. Leprosy hospitals or lazar houses were common throughout Europe and offered care, isolation, and spiritual guidance for those afflicted. Another dreaded illness was the plague, which swept through Europe in terrifying waves. The Black Death, which would arrive in the 14th century, had not yet made its infamous appearance. But earlier outbreaks still haunted communities. With no understanding of bacteria or viruses, medieval people blamed everything from bad air to divine wrath. Treatments included burning aromatic herbs, ringing bells to drive away evil spirits, or in more desperate times, flagellation processions, where people whipped themselves in public to atone for the sins of the world. Despite the doom and gloom, medieval medicine wasn't without its victories. Surgery, once seen as the domain of low-status barbers and butchers, began to rise in respectability. Though still dangerous, with no anesthesia and limited knowledge of infection control, surgeons developed techniques for amputations, wound cleaning, and even trepanation, the ancient skull drilling practice, still making appearances in textbooks and skulls alike. The Church's ban on human dissection was slowly eroded by the later Middle Ages, allowing anatomists to begin exploring the human body in more detail. This paved the way for the anatomical breakthroughs of the Renaissance. So what can we say about healing in medieval Europe? It was messy, imperfect, deeply spiritual, and strangely poetic. It was a world where the stars guided surgery schedules, where monks tended herb gardens in silent devotion, and where a kindly neighbor with a jar of salve might be your best hope on a winter night. Above all, it was a time when medicine was still part magic, part memory, and part miracle. And while the tools may have been rudimentary, and the theories occasionally eyebrow-raising, the intention to care, to comfort, to cure remained as human as ever. The Black Death, a pandemic that shook the world, the medieval world had its share of struck wars, famines, and an alarming enthusiasm for bloodletting, but nothing gripped it quite like the arrival of the plague. It came silently, almost invisibly, riding in on trade routes, clinging to rats and fleas, hidden in bundles of cloth and barrels of grain. And once it arrived, it didn't politely knock, it tore through towns and villages with a speed and ferocity that left people stunned, frightened, and scrambling to find answers. Let's travel back to the year 1347. Ships arrive in the Sicilian port of Messina. After a long journey from the Black Sea, some of the sailors aboard are already dead. Others are feverish, coughing, and covered in large, black swellings. The townspeople don't know it yet, but they've just welcomed the Black Death into Europe. Over the next 5 years, the plague would sweep across the continent, killing an estimated 25 million people, nearly a third of Europe's population. In some cities, the death toll reached as high as 70%. Entire villages were abandoned. Fields lay fallow. The world felt like it was ending, and for many it was. The disease moved with terrifying speed. In some cases, people woke healthy in the morning and were dead by nightfall. It began with flu-like symptoms: fever, chills, weakness. Then came the swelling. Painful, black buboes usually appeared in the armpits, groin, or neck. These swellings could burst and ooze pus and blood. Some people developed a cough that brought up blood, the pneumonic form of the plague, which could spread directly from person to person through droplets in the air. And then there was septicemic plague, where the infection entered the bloodstream and caused death within hours. It was as swift as it was merciless. But what exactly was the Black Death? Modern science tells us it was caused by the bacterium Yersinia pestis, usually transmitted through the bite of infected fleas carried by rats. Once the bacterium entered the human body, it could travel through the lymphatic system, the lungs, or the bloodstream, depending on the form. In the cramped, unsanitary conditions of medieval Europe with crowded cities, poor hygiene, and limited understanding of disease, transmission it was the perfect storm. But of course, people at the time had no idea what a bacterium was. Germ theory wouldn't arrive for another 500 years, so they reached for the explanations they had. One popular theory was miasma, the idea that disease was caused by bad air or noxious vapors. People burned aromatic herbs, carried posies of flowers, or pressed sweet-smelling sponges to their faces to ward off infection. You might recognize this approach in the now iconic plague. Doctor costumed the long-beaked mask filled with fragrant substances designed to filter the air. The outfit also included a long cloak, gloves, and a cane to poke or examine patients. From a distance, it looked impressive, a little eerie, and was only mildly effective at best. Other theories veered into more spiritual or astrological territory. Some believed the plague was a punishment from God for the sins of humanity. The appearance of comets and planetary alignments were taken as omens. In an effort to atone, groups of flagellants traveled from town to town, whipping themselves in public processions to demonstrate repentance. These grim, chanting pilgrims hoped their suffering would persuade the heavens to end the plague. They also inadvertently helped spread it. Medical treatments were understandably limited. Physicians suggested bloodletting, purgatives, and herbal concoctions. Some recommended placing onions or dried toads on the buboes. Others proposed sitting between two large fires to cleanse the air. A few, recognizing the hopelessness of it all, simply advised fleeing to the countryside and waiting it out. For many, the most effective strategy was quarantine. During this period, the concept of quarantine began to formalize. The city of Venice, a major trading hub, imposed a rule that arriving ships had to wait offshore for 40 days before docking. This waiting period, 40 giorni, or 40 days in Italian, gave us the word quarantine. It was one of the earliest attempts to use isolation to control disease, and it proved to be a relatively effective measure, at least compared to the alternative of doing nothing. Elsewhere, whole towns locked their gates. Some communities cut themselves off completely, allowing no one in or out. One of the most famous examples is the village of Am in England. In 1665, when plague arrived via a parcel of cloth, the villagers made the extraordinary decision to quarantine themselves to protect the surrounding areas. Over the course of a year, over 200 people in Am died, but the plague didn't spread beyond its borders. It was an act of heartbreaking bravery. The social consequences of the plague were as profound as the medical ones. With so many dead, labor became scarce, which gave surviving workers more bargaining power. Feudal systems began to shift. Religious institutions were shaken. Why? People asked, would God allow such suffering? Many communities, in their desperation, turned on minorities and scapegoats. Jewish communities were often falsely blamed for poisoning wells, leading to horrific violence and massacres. It was a tragic reminder of how fear can so easily be twisted into hate. In the midst of all this, some positive changes began to take root. The sheer scale of the crisis forced people to reconsider health and hygiene. Cities began to invest more in sanitation. The idea of public health, that the community had a role in preventing disease, started to emerge, however slowly. While medical knowledge didn't improve overnight, the Black Death created a demand for better understanding. The seed was planted. It's worth noting that this wasn't the first time Yersinia pestis had made a deadly appearance. Earlier pandemics, such as the plague of Justinian in the 6th century, had ravaged the Eastern Roman Empire, killing millions, and it wouldn't be the last time plague appeared in waves across Europe and Asia, but the 14th century outbreak remains the most infamous, a grim milestone in the history of sickness. It showed how fragile society could be in the face of an invisible enemy, how deeply disease could touch every part of life, from the food you ate, to the prayers you said, to the people you buried. Yet despite the chaos, humanity persisted. There were acts of courage, acts of compassion. People cared for the sick even at risk to themselves. Some kept meticulous records, hoping to understand the plague better next time. Others sang songs, told stories, and found ways to laugh in the darkness. The world was wounded, yes, but it did not break. While the Black Death is remembered for its horror, it's also a testament to human endurance. The lessons were painful, but they laid the groundwork for the future, where medicine would slowly shift from guesswork to science. A future where sickness would still come, but with each outbreak, we'd be just a little more prepared. The Renaissance rebirth of anatomy and surgery. The Renaissance, a word that means rebirth, conjures images of artists painting masterpieces, poets composing verses by candlelight, and scholars rediscovering ancient texts in forgotten libraries. But amid all the portraits and poetry, something equally remarkable was happening beneath the skin, literally. The Renaissance was also a rebirth of anatomy, surgery, and a bold willingness to question centuries of inherited medical wisdom. The human body, long shrouded in mystery and religious taboo, was being unveiled one careful cut at a time. In medieval Europe, dissecting a human body had been a controversial and often prohibited act. The Church maintained strict control over what could be done to the deceased, and physicians had little access to real human anatomy. Most of their knowledge came from the ancient texts of Galen, that brilliant Roman physician who, despite his insights, had based much of his work on dissecting animals, especially monkeys and pigs. While a monkey's insides can be impressively similar to ours, they aren't quite the same. Enter the Renaissance, a time when scholars began to question received wisdom and ask a radical question: what if the old texts were wrong? This wasn't just academic rebellion, it was driven by a desire to see, to observe the body not through scripture or superstition, but through direct examination. At the heart of this anatomical revolution was a man named Andreas Vesalius, born in 1514 in what is now Belgium. Vesalius was trained in medicine and surgery and later became a professor at the University of Padua in Italy, one of Europe's most prestigious medical schools. But Vesalius was not content to simply lecture from the works of Galen. He wanted to investigate for himself. And so, in lecture halls and anatomical theatres, often surrounded by students and the curious public, he did something bold. He performed public dissections on human cadavers. These were usually the bodies of executed criminals, the only legal source of human remains at the time. It was gruesome work, and not without risk of scandal, but Vesalius believed the human body had secrets worth uncovering. What he found astonished him. The human liver, he noted, was not 5 lobes, as Galen had described. The jawbone was made of 1 bone, not 2. The heart, far from being just a furnace of heat and emotion, had valves, chambers, and astonishing complexity. Vesalius wasn't merely correcting mistakes, he was rewriting the map of the human body. In 1543, he published his masterpiece, De Humani Corporis Fabrica, on the fabric of the human body. It was a massive, lavishly illustrated book, filled with detailed drawings of bones, muscles, organs, and veins. These illustrations were works of art, as much as science, precise, elegant, and surprisingly human. Figures were posed as if they were stretching, dancing, or contemplating their own intestines. It wasn't just anatomy, it was anatomy with personality. Fabrica, as it came to be known, was revolutionary. It challenged centuries of medical doctrine and inspired a generation of anatomists to open up the body for themselves. dissection became a vital part of medical education. Physicians began to rely less on inherited texts and more on first-hand observation. The body was no longer a mystical vessel, it was a landscape to be explored, studied, and understood. But the Renaissance wasn't just about dissection, it was also a time of tremendous surgical development. In earlier centuries, surgery had been considered something of a manual trade best left to barbers who could cut hair, pull teeth, and amputate limbs, all for a modest fee and minimal dignity. But in the Renaissance, surgery began to move up. In the world, part of the shift came from the battlefield. As firearms became more common, so did horrific new kinds of injuries. Bullets shattered bones and tore flesh in ways swords never had. Traditional treatments like cauterizing wounds with red-hot irons or boiling oil were as brutal as they sound. But necessity breeds innovation, and some surgeons began to look for better methods. One of the most famous was Ambroise Paré, a French barber surgeon who served in military campaigns during the 16th century. Paré didn't have a university education, but he had a careful eye and a compassionate heart. One day, during a particularly gruesome battle, Paré ran out of boiling oil. In a moment of desperation, he mixed a gentle ointment of egg yolk, rose oil, and turpentine, and applied it to his patient's wounds. To his astonishment, those treated with the ointment healed better and experienced less pain than those who had been seared with oil. It was a turning point in wound care and a lesson in the value of observation over tradition. Paré also reintroduced the practice of ligating arteries during amputations, tying them off with silk threads instead of burning them shut. This reduced pain, bleeding, and infection and made surgery more survivable. He believed that surgery should be guided not just by technique, but by kindness. He famously wrote, "I dressed him, God healed him," a humble recognition of the limits of medical intervention and the power of nature. The Renaissance also saw advances in medical illustration, instrument design, and even the classification of diseases. Doctors began grouping illnesses by symptoms rather than moral or spiritual causes. Fevers were described in types intermittent, continuous, or eruptive rather than simply being seen as punishments for sin or signs of demonic possession. It was an early step toward the modern diagnosis. There was also a growing interest in the body's systems, the circulation of blood, the movement of muscles, the workings of the brain, while the full circulatory system wouldn't be mapped. Until William Harvey's work in the 17th century, Renaissance thinkers laid the groundwork. They knew something was moving through the veins, they just hadn't quite figured out the plumbing still. Some old ideas persisted. The theory of the for humors remained popular. Astrology still influenced some physicians might still prescribe a course of bloodletting during a favorable moon phase or recommend purging to balance excess black bile. But more and more, medicine was shifting from a mystical art to an observational science. Renaissance hospitals, too, began to change. While still primarily places of comfort and prayer, they became more organized, more specialized. In some cities, they began recording patient symptoms, outcomes, and treatments, early forms of medical record keeping. Care was still rudimentary by modern standards, but it was increasingly grounded in reason. Perhaps the most important transformation was in attitude. The Renaissance marked a return to the belief that human beings could understand the world through study, experimentation, and reason. It was a time of great beauty, yes, but also of great bravery. To cut into a human body, to question ancient authorities, to challenge centuries of tradition, these were not small acts. They were bold, sometimes dangerous, and always rooted in the belief that knowledge mattered. So the next time you see a diagram of the human skeleton, or read a pamphlet on how your lungs work, spare a thought for Vesalius, for Paré, and for the many unsung anatomists who turned their gaze inward not to mystify the body, but to understand it. Because the Renaissance didn't just revive art and architecture. It revived the idea that health, like a great painting or a mathematical equation, could be studied, sketched, and slowly brought into focus one layer at a time. The alchemical roots of modern pharmacology, alchemy, and medicine have always had something in common. Both are, at heart, quests to transform. Alchemy sought to turn base metals into gold and to discover the elusive elixir of life. Medicine, in its own way, tried to turn illness into health, suffering into relief. And during the late Middle Ages and early Renaissance, the two disciplines often walked hand in hand, one foot in mystical speculation, the other in early chemical experimentation. There was a time when a potion could be part science, part spell, and a physician might just as easily be called a philosopher, an astrologer, or a sorcerer, depending on who was asking. This was the age of Paracelsus, one of the most controversial, fascinating, and oddly forward-thinking figures in the history of medicine. Born in Switzerland around the year 1493, Paracelsus was a physician, alchemist, and traveling healer who rejected much of the traditional medical doctrine of his time. He threw out the old rule books, literally. He famously burned the works of Galen and Avicenna, declaring them outdated. Bold move, questionable fire safety. Paracelsus believed that true medicine should come not from dusty books, but from nature, experience, and observation. He wandered through mines, studied plants, and spoke with midwives, barbers, and local healers. He saw the world as a great chemical laboratory, where the body was a miniature version of the universe, a microcosm. Within the macrocosm, health, he believed, was about harmony between the two. But perhaps Paracelsus's most revolutionary idea was this: the dose makes the poison. In other words, even toxic substances could be healing in small, carefully measured amounts. Even helpful substances could be harmful if overused. This insight forms the foundation of toxicology and remains one of the cornerstones of pharmacology today. To Paracelsus, the body wasn't governed by four humors, it was governed by chemical processes. He experimented with minerals and metals, using compounds like mercury, sulfur, and arsenic in his treatments. Yes, mercury and arsenic substances we now avoid at all costs were once believed to hold curative properties. To be fair, he wasn't entirely wrong. Some compounds containing heavy metals do have medicinal applications even today. It all depends, as he said, on the dose. Paracelsus also popularized the use of tinctures, elixirs, and spagyric preparations, plant-based remedies that were distilled, fermented, or otherwise transformed through alchemical processes. These weren't your grandmother's teas. They were complex, pungent, and sometimes explosive. In a world where medicine was often just trial and error with herbs, Paracelsus introduced the idea that chemistry could refine nature's tools into something more potent and, perhaps more dangerous, of course. Paracelsus wasn't operating in a vacuum. The idea of alchemy, the forerunner of modern chemistry, had deep roots in both the Islamic and European traditions. Alchemists believed that everything in the universe was made up of basic principles: air, fire, water, and that substances could be purified, broken down, or recombined in new and magical ways. They developed elaborate tools, retorts, crucibles, alembics, and filled their laboratories with bubbling flasks, smoky fires, and the occasional unexpected explosion. Some alchemists worked in secrecy, guarding their recipes with obscure symbols and riddles. Others shared their findings freely, hoping to illuminate the hidden workings of the natural world. Through these practices, alchemy accidentally laid the groundwork for chemistry. The techniques alchemists used, distillation, sublimation, crystallization, would eventually be adopted and refined by scientific chemists. In fact, Many modern pharmaceuticals still rely on processes that were first explored by alchemists hundreds of years ago. Even if the language has changed, alchemy wasn't all about turning lead into gold, though that was a very popular hobby. It was also about understanding the transformative powers of nature, including those that might heal the human body. Alchemists often crossed paths with physicians or became them. Their potions weren't just magical curiosities, they were the earliest forms of compound medicine. One widely used remedy was laudanum, a tincture of opium in alcohol. Introduced in the 16th century, it became wildly popular as a painkiller, sleep aid, and general cure-all. It was, in essence, liquid comfort, and while it was undoubtedly effective in easing suffering, it was also dangerously addictive. The idea of weighing benefit against risk, now central to pharmacology, was still in its infancy. Another key development during this time was the rise of apothecaries. These early drugstores offered everything from ground herbs and spices to mineral powders and preserved animal parts. The apothecary was often a place of community gossip as well as medical consultation. People came in with toothaches, fevers, broken hearts, or just curiosity, and left with packets of powder, little glass vials, and occasionally a dried frog wrapped in linen for spiritual purposes. Naturally, apothecaries didn't just sell ingredients, they often prepared them as well. They ground roots into powders, distilled flowers into oils, and mixed their own pills and syrups. Recipes were handed down through generations or copied from medical texts. Accuracy was important, and so was artistry. A well-made tonic was as much about the smell, color, and texture as it was about the effect. If it worked and looked impressive, all the better. Still, without modern regulations, medicine was a bit of a Wild West. Some apothecaries operated with great care and knowledge. Others, well, let's just say not every glowing bottle was filled with wisdom. Quackery thrived alongside science, and distinguishing between the two could be a challenge even for doctors. But the cultural shift was clear. Medicine was moving away from vague theories and toward more measurable methods. Physicians and healers were beginning to think in terms of chemical interactions, not just spiritual balance. The body was increasingly seen not as a sacred mystery, but as a chemical machine, one that could be fine-tuned, cleansed, and recalibrated with the right substances. One of the long-lasting impacts of this era was the beginning of standardized medicine. Recipes for compounds began to be recorded and shared. Dosages were measured more precisely. Treatments could be replicated and eventually tested. It would still take centuries for true scientific pharmacology to emerge, but the seeds were planted here in the smoky labs of alchemists and the cluttered counters of apothecaries. Looking back, it's tempting to smile at some of the stranger practices of the time-drinking gold-infused elixirs, applying mercury ointments or sleeping with a crystal on your forehead to align your humors. But within all that eccentricity was a profound yearning, the desire to understand the body, to heal pain, to transform the suffering of illness into the golden promise of relief. And so, in the flickering candlelight of 16th century labs, with bubbling flasks and ink-stained notes, the future of medicine quietly stirred. Science was still wrapped in mystery, but it was beginning to untangle itself, one potion at a time. The microscopic revolution, unveiling the invisible world science, changed forever with the invention of the microscope. Suddenly, what was once invisible, too small to hidden, could be seen with astonishing clarity. Fleas became monsters. Pond water teemed with life. And crucially, the human body was revealed to be far more complicated than anyone had imagined. Tiny creatures, once the stuff of folklore and suspicion, were found to be very real and very alive. It was the beginning of a new era in medicine, the age of the microbe. Let's begin with a man who liked to tinker. In the late 17th century, a Dutch tradesman named Anthony van Leeuwenhoek was fiddling with lenses. He wasn't a doctor or a scientist by formal training. He sold cloth. But he had a curiosity sharper than any scalpel and an eye for detail. Using hand-ground glass lenses, Leeuwenhoek created tiny, powerful microscopes, some of which could magnify objects up to 270 times their size. That may not sound impressive today, but at the time, it was revolutionary. Leeuwenhoek didn't invent the microscope, but he was the first to really see with it. He peered at rainwater, dental plaque, and blood, and what he saw shocked him. Tiny creatures, animalcules, as he called them, swam, wriggled, and darted across his field of vision. These were the first recorded observations of bacteria, protozoa, and other microorganisms. For the first time, humanity glimpsed the hidden world that lived all around us and inside us. Leeuwenhoek shared his discoveries with the Royal Society in London, but the medical world didn't immediately change. At the time, doctors still subscribed to the miasma theory, the belief that disease was caused by bad smells or corrupted air. The idea of tiny, invisible creatures making people sick seemed far-fetched. But slowly, the pieces began to come together. By the 19th century, the germ theory of disease would finally begin to challenge centuries of belief. One of the key figures in this microbial revolution was a French chemist named Louis Pasteur. Pasteur started out studying fermentation in wine and beer, which, let's be honest, is a very noble scientific cause. He discovered that certain microorganisms were responsible for turning sugar into alcohol, and that when the wrong microbes got involved, the result was spoiled, sour wine. That observation led to the process we now call pasteurization, heating liquids to kill harmful microbes without affecting the taste. But Pasteur didn't stop at spoiled wine. He began to suspect that diseases, too, might be caused by microscopic invaders. Through careful experimentation, he showed that bad air or supernatural forces were the true culprits behind many illnesses. He even developed vaccines, first for chicken cholera, then for anthrax, and most famously for rabies. Pasteur's work laid the foundation for modern microbiology. His vaccine research saved countless lives. Meanwhile, in Germany, a physician named Robert Koch was taking the next step. Koch was methodical, precise, and deeply interested in infectious diseases. In the 1880s, he identified the bacteria that caused tuberculosis, cholera, and anthrax. Using improved staining techniques in cultures, he was able to grow and isolate bacteria in the lab, giving scientists a way to study microbes more directly than ever before. Koch also established what became known as Koch's postulates, a series of criteria for proving that a specific microorganism causes a specific disease. It was a huge breakthrough. For the first time, we could say with certainty, this microbe causes this disease. These discoveries transformed medicine, almost overnight or as quickly as such things can happen. Suddenly, diseases like cholera, typhoid, diphtheria, and tuberculosis were no longer terrifying mysteries. They were the result of specific, identifiable organisms. And with identification came the possibility of prevention and treatment. One of the first practical consequences of germ theory was a new focus on hygiene. If tiny creatures could cause disease, then cleanliness became a medical necessity. Enter Ignaz Semmelweis, an Austrian doctor, who noticed something odd in the 1840s. Women giving birth in hospital wards, staffed by doctors, were dying of childbed fever at a much higher rate than those attended by midwives. The doctors, it turned out, were performing autopsies and then, without washing their hands, assisting in childbirth. Semmelweis proposed a radical solution: hand washing specifically. He instructed doctors to wash their hands in a solution of chlorinated lime before touching patients. The mortality rate plummeted. It was, by all accounts, a medical miracle. And yet, many of Semmelweis's contemporaries refused to believe it. The idea that a gentleman doctor's hands could be dirty enough to kill was offensive to some. Semmelweis faced ridicule and eventually died in an asylum. But history vindicated him. Hygiene soon became a cornerstone of modern medicine. Surgeons began sterilizing tools, cleaning wounds more carefully, and wearing gloves. Hospitals enforced sanitation protocols. Midwives and nurses were trained in cleanliness, and while it took time for these practices to become widespread, the results were undeniable. Infection rates dropped. Recovery improved. Surgery became safer. The microscope became a critical medical tool. Scientists could now identify and study pathogens. They developed diagnostic tests and explored the microscopic universe inside the human body. It led to discoveries about the immune system, the structure of cells, and the complex dance between host and invader. But perhaps the most important part of the germ theory revolution was that it gave us agency. For the first time, we weren't helpless in the face of disease. We could understand it, trace it, interrupt its transmission. This changed not just treatment, but public health itself. Governments began investing in clean water systems, sewage disposal, and food safety. Cities launched public health campaigns encouraging hand washing, vaccination, and proper sanitation. Quarantines became more targeted and effective. Diseases that had once wiped out millions were gradually brought under control. And as our understanding of microbes grew, so too did our ability to fight them. The stage was set for the development of antibiotics, vaccines, and antiseptics innovations that would come to define modern medicine. Yet even now, the world of microbes continues to surprise us. They're incredibly diverse, adaptable, and sometimes frustratingly sneaky. They can lie dormant for years, mutate into new forms, and find their way into places we thought were sterile. They're not just enemies, some of them are essential. The human body is home to trillions of microbes, most of which are harmless or even helpful. The gut microbiome, for example, plays a vital role in digestion, immunity, and even mental health. Today, we live in a world where microscopes are more powerful than ever. We can map genomes, study viruses in incredible detail, and monitor bacteria as they evolve. And it all began with a few curious minds and some very polished lenses. The age of the microbe may have begun centuries ago, but it's still unfolding. Every time we swab a wound, boil a bottle, or sneeze into our elbow, we're participating in a quiet, invisible battle. One where knowledge is our best weapon. Because once you know the enemy is real and, very, very small, you can begin to fight it. And maybe, just maybe, win. Edward Jenner and the birth of vaccination in the peaceful English countryside of the late 1700s. Something strange was happening in the dairies. Milkmaids, those who spent their days tending cows and churning cream, were noted for their smooth, unblemished complexions. Unlike many others, they rarely seemed to suffer from smallpox, one of the most feared and deadly diseases of the time. Their secret? They had all, at some point, contracted a milder illness called cowpox. It gave them fever and a few lesions, but they recovered quickly. And then, it seemed, they never caught smallpox. This curious observation caught the attention of an English physician named Edward Jenner. Born in 1749, Jenner was a country doctor with a sharp mind and a deep sense of curiosity. He had heard the rumors about milkmaids and began to wonder, could exposure to cowpox actually protect someone from smallpox? At the time, smallpox was a nightmare. It killed about 1 in 3 people who caught it. Survivors were often left blind, scarred, and permanently weakened. Outbreaks could wipe out entire communities, and there was no known cure. The only form of prevention was something called variolation, a risky practice in which a healthy person was deliberately infected with smallpox, usually by inserting dried pus or scabs from an infected person into a small cut on the skin. The idea was that the person would get a mild case and develop immunity. Sometimes it worked. Sometimes it killed the patient or started a new outbreak. It was, to put it lightly, a medical gamble. Jenner had a better idea. In 1796, he performed a bold experiment. He took pus from the cowpox lesions on a milkmaid named Sarah Nelms and rubbed it into small cuts on the arm of an 8-year-old boy named James Phipps. The boy developed a mild fever and some discomfort, but recovered fully. A few weeks later, Jenner exposed James to smallpox. Remarkably, the boy did not become ill. He was immune. It was the birth of vaccination, a term Jenner coined from the Latin vacca, meaning cow. He had discovered a way to protect people from one of the deadliest diseases in history, using a related, but much gentler virus. It was a revolutionary moment in medical history. At first, not everyone was convinced. The idea of using cowpox to prevent smallpox struck many as bizarre, or even blasphemous. Political cartoons of the time mocked Jenner, imagining people sprouting cow parts after receiving the vaccine. But over time, the results were impossible to ignore. Vaccinated individuals were far less likely to die during outbreaks. Word spread quickly, quite literally saving lives. Within just a few decades, vaccination became common across Europe and eventually around the world. Governments began organizing mass vaccination campaigns. Medical societies praised Jenner's work as one of the greatest breakthroughs in the history of medicine. But what is vaccination, exactly? At its core, a vaccine trains the immune system to recognize and fight a specific pathogen, usually a virus or bacterium, without causing a full-blown illness. It's a bit like showing a security team a mugshot before the criminal arrives. The body learns what to look out for and mounts a faster, stronger defense when the real threat shows up. Vaccines work by introducing a harmless version of the pathogen. It might be weakened, killed, or even just a fragment of the germ like a protein. The immune system responds by creating antibodies and memory cells that remain vigilant for life. As vaccine science progressed, other deadly diseases began to meet their match. In the late 1800s and early 1900s, scientists developed vaccines for rabies, typhoid, and cholera. Later, vaccines emerged for diphtheria, tetanus, whooping cough, and polio. Each one was a step forward, not just in preventing individual suffering, but in improving public health on a massive scale. One of the most dramatic victories came in the 20th century, with the global push to eradicate smallpox entirely. The World Health Organization launched a worldwide vaccination campaign in 1967. Targeting outbreaks with precision, health workers traveled by foot, jeep, boat, and even elephant to reach remote villages. It was an extraordinary effort of global cooperation, and it worked. In 1980, smallpox was officially declared eradicated. The first and, so far, only human disease to be completely wiped out from the planet. There are no more natural cases, no more outbreaks, and no more need for smallpox vaccination in the general population. Of course, vaccination hasn't always had an easy ride. From its earliest days, it has faced skepticism, misunderstanding, and misinformation. In the 19th century, some people protested mandatory vaccination laws, viewing them as government overreach. Others feared the idea of putting a disease into a healthy person even if the science supported it. Modern vaccines are thoroughly tested and carefully monitored, but fears, however unfounded, still circulate. Yet the benefits are enormous. vaccines have prevented countless deaths, reduced disease transmission, and even protected those who cannot be vaccinated through a concept known as herd immunity. Herd immunity occurs when a high enough percentage of a population is immune to a disease, making it unlikely to spread. This protects vulnerable individuals like infants, the elderly, or those with weakened immune systems, who may not be able to receive vaccines themselves. The science of vaccines has continued to evolve. Today, we have vaccines made from mRNA, recombinant proteins, and viral vectors technologies that would have been unimaginable in Jenner's time. These innovations allow us to develop vaccines more quickly and tailor them more precisely to emerging threats. Take the COVID-19 pandemic, for example. Within a year of identifying the virus, scientists developed and distributed effective vaccines using brand new platforms. It was the fastest vaccine rollout in history, backed by decades of research into immunology, genetics, and virology. Vaccination has also helped control diseases like measles, mumps, rubella, hepatitis, HPV, and influenza. In many parts of the world, diseases that once terrified parents are now vanishingly rare. Thanks to widespread immunization programs, the future looks brighter than ever. Of course, there's still work to be done. In some areas, access to vaccines remains limited due to conflict, poverty, or logistical challenges. Global health organizations continue to work toward more equitable distribution. Infectious diseases don't respect borders and neither should solutions. Despite the occasional setbacks and ongoing debates, the impact of vaccination is undeniable. It is, without question, one of the greatest public health achievements in human history. And to think it all began with a milkmaid and a cow. So the next time you roll up your sleeve for a jab, remember that you're taking part in a long, extraordinary tradition. A tradition born from curiosity, courage, and compassion. From village dairies to global campaigns, vaccination has always been about more than medicine. It's about hope, the quiet, powerful belief that we can protect one another, one tiny needle at a time. The birth of evidence-based medicine has always been a mix of art and science, and evolving puzzle with shifting pieces. But it wasn't until the last few centuries that it began to look and feel like the structured, evidence-based practice we know today. The era of trial and error, of potions and guesswork, slowly gave way to laboratories, data, and double-blind studies. This transformation didn't happen overnight. It took generations of questioning, testing, and refining, and it all began with one deceptively simple idea: noticing patterns. Long before clinical trials and control groups, physicians had begun to realize that not all treatments worked equally for everyone. Some remedies seemed to help, others didn't. Some patients recovered on their own. Others slipped away despite every effort. It was confusing, messy, inexact, but one group of pioneers believed the key to understanding medicine lay not in more remedies, but in better methods. One of the earliest and most influential voices in this shift was Pierre Louis, a French physician in the early 19th century. Louis studied patients with tuberculosis and compared the outcomes of those treated with aggressive bloodletting, common practice at the time, and those who were not. His findings were clear and too many. Shocking, bloodletting didn't help. In fact, it often made things worse. Louis wasn't just guessing. He used numbers. He collected data. He analyzed cases. He published his results. He introduced what we now call the numerical method, an early statistics-based approach to medicine. His work laid the groundwork for what would later become evidence-based medicine. But the real revolution began in earnest in the 20th century, with the rise of the randomized controlled trial, or RCT. Think of it as the gold standard of medical research. Here's how it works. A group of patients is divided into two or more groups. One receives the treatment being tested. Another, the control group, receives either a standard treatment or a placebo, a harmless, inert substance. Neither the patients nor the researchers know who is getting what. It's a double-blind trial. Only the data matters. This method might seem obvious now, but it was revolutionary at the time. Before this, many treatments were adopted simply because they seemed to work or because they were endorsed by respected doctors. There was no consistent way to separate anecdote from actual evidence. One of the first large-scale examples of an RCT came during World War II, when researchers tested the antibiotic streptomycin for the treatment of tuberculosis. The trial was carefully designed and rigorously conducted. It showed that the drug was highly effective. It helped turn tuberculosis from a death sentence into a treatable disease. And it showed the world that controlled trials could produce powerful, life-saving knowledge. From there, the floodgates opened. Medicine embraced the scientific method with gusto. Every new treatment, from painkillers to cancer drugs, began to be tested in structured trials. Guidelines were written, regulatory bodies formed. Drugs had to be proven safe and effective before being released to the public. The placebo effect, the measurable, sometimes powerful benefits of belief alone, was finally understood and accounted for in research. But modern medicine wasn't just about better trials, it was also about better tools. In the 19th and early 20th centuries, medical technology leaped forward in extraordinary ways. The stethoscope, invented in the early 1800s, allowed doctors to hear the inner workings of the chest. The thermometer brought precision to fevers. The sphygmomanometer gave us blood pressure readings. Then came imaging. In 1895, a German physicist named Wilhelm Röntgen discovered X-rays. Suddenly, doctors could see inside the human body without making a single cut. Bones, lungs, foreign objects suddenly visible. The implications were enormous. Broken bones could be set with accuracy. Bullets could be located. Tumors could be spotted early. The 20th century gave us ultrasound, CT scans, and MRI machines, increasingly sophisticated ways of peering inside the body with astonishing clarity. Diagnosis became less about guesswork and more about visual confirmation. Alongside this, the laboratory became central to medicine. Blood tests, urine samples, biopsies could be analyzed to provide information about infection, hormone levels, organ function, and more. The body's secrets, once hidden inside, now be read like a carefully written report. But none of this would matter without the scientific approach to treatment itself. One of the greatest triumphs of modern medicine has been the development of antibiotics. In 1928, Alexander Fleming discovered penicillin accidentally. A moldy petri dish he had left uncovered revealed that a substance later identified as penicillin was killing bacteria. It would take more than a decade to turn Fleming's discovery into a usable drug. During World War II, a team of researchers in Oxford, led by Howard Florey and Ernst Chain, figured out how to purify and mass-produce penicillin. By D-Day in 1944, penicillin was available in large enough quantities to treat wounded soldiers on the battlefield. And it worked like magic. Infections that once killed quickly were now treatable with a few doses. Penicillin marked the dawn of the antibiotic age, and it was just the beginning. Soon came streptomycin, tetracyclines, sulfonamides, cephalosporins, and many more. Antibiotics revolutionized medicine. They made surgery safer, childbirth less deadly, infectious diseases far less terrifying. But overuse and misuse led to new challenges: antibiotic resistance, where bacteria evolved to survive even the strongest drugs. Yet even this problem is being met with science. New drugs, new approaches, and smarter prescribing guidelines are all part of the response. Another major leap forward came in the treatment of chronic conditions. High blood pressure, diabetes, asthma, depression, once life-limiting or poorly understood, are now managed with a combination of medication, lifestyle advice, and regular monitoring. The goal is no longer just to cure but to maintain quality of life, sometimes for decades. Surgery, too, transformed. Once a bloody, frantic affair, it is now precise, often minimally invasive, and conducted with astonishing care. Techniques like laparoscopy using small incisions and cameras have reduced recovery times and complications. Robotic surgery by skilled hands and high-def screens offers incredible precision. All of these advances, from drugs to diagnostics to data, have changed the way we think about medicine. It's no longer just something done to you, it's something done with you. Patient consent, shared decision-making, and informed choice are now essential parts of care. And while modern medicine is often portrayed as cold or clinical, it remains deeply human. Behind every machine and prescription is a relationship built on trust. Perhaps that's the real triumph of modern medicine, not just its science, but its ability to combine knowledge with kindness. Because even with all the trials, scans, molecules, and microscopes, sometimes what matters most is a hand to hold, a voice to explain, or a moment of hope. And if you can have those things along with a carefully tested antibiotic or a vaccine, you're in pretty good shape. So here's to the modern age of medicine: precise, powerful, and still somehow profoundly personal. Anesthesia and antisepsis. The transformation of surgery. The operating room of today's looming, sterile, humming with quiet confidences, a world apart from its grim and grisly ancestors. Today, we expect to drift off peacefully before a scalpel touches skin and wake up stitched, monitored, and perhaps a bit groggy, but very much alive. Yet not so long ago, surgery was an ordeal of raw courage and speed. Patients were held down, screaming. Surgeons raced the clock not because they were busy, but because they had to finish before the pain or blood loss overwhelmed the patient. For most of history, surgery was a last resort. It was used when the alternative was almost certainly death. Gangrenous limbs, deep abscesses, wounds that wouldn't stop bleeding. These were the only reasons to undergo the knife. The surgeon's tools were simple: knives, saws, hooks, and a bucket for the aftermath. And the patient's options for pain relief were limited. Alcohol might help. A piece of wood to bite down on was popular. Some herbs could dull the senses, but nothing reliable, nothing safe. Speed was everything. The best surgeons were the fastest, not the most careful, in the 18th and early 19th centuries. An amputation in under 2 minutes was considered excellent form. Patients often passed out from shock. Some didn't survive the ordeal. Infection was so common afterward that hospitals earned grim nicknames like houses of death. Then, in the mid-19th century, everything changed. In 1846, in Boston, Massachusetts, a dentist named William T.G. Morton performed a public demonstration that stunned the medical world. He administered ether gas to a patient before a surgical procedure to remove a neck tumor. The patient did not scream, did not flinch, lay still and pain-free. The audience was stunned into silence. Surgery, they realized, didn't have to hurt. News of Morton's success spread quickly. Ether was soon joined by chloroform, which became popular in Britain especially after Queen Victoria used it during childbirth in 1853, giving it royal approval. Other agents followed: nitrous oxide, halothane, and eventually the wide range of modern anesthetics we use today. Anesthesia didn't just reduce suffering, it opened the door to longer, more precise, and more complex surgeries. With pain out of the equation, surgeons could take their time, explore, repair rather than simply remove, operate on internal organs, not just limbs, even enter the skull or the heart feats, previously unthinkable. But there was still one massive problem: infection. Even with a patient asleep and still, surgery remained incredibly dangerous. Post-operative infections were common and deadly. Surgeons might operate in the same blood-stained apron day after day. Instruments were rarely cleaned. Hands went unwashed between patients. No one understood why so many surgeries ended in fever, swelling, and death. That changed in the 1860s, thanks to a British surgeon named Joseph Lister. Working in Glasgow, Lister had been following the new theories of Louis Pasteur, who had shown that microbes invisible to the naked eye could spoil wine, rot food, and infect wounds. Lister suspected these same unseen enemies were lurking in surgical wounds. He decided to test it. He began using carbolic acid, a powerful antiseptic, to clean wounds, soak dressings, and even spray into the air during surgeries. The results were dramatic. Infections dropped. Survival rates improved. For the first time, surgeons had a way to fight the invisible enemies that lurked in instruments, in hands, and in the air. Lister published his findings and became a pioneer of antiseptic surgery. Slowly, painfully, the surgical community began to accept his methods. Resistance was common. Old habits die hard, especially when soaked in tradition. But the evidence was overwhelming. From antiseptic practices came aseptic surgery, the idea of creating a sterile environment from the start, sterilizing tools with heat, washing hands thoroughly, wearing clean gowns and gloves, using sterile drapes. The result was a revolution in safety. Surgery was no longer a desperate act. It became a discipline, a science, even an art. Techniques improved rapidly in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Surgeons began repairing hernias, removing appendixes, and treating aneurysms. The first successful heart surgery took place in 1896. Brain surgery followed. Entire fields emerged: neurosurgery, orthopedics, plastic surgery, and many more. The 20th century brought more wonders. Blood transfusions became safe and routine, thanks to the discovery of blood types. X-rays allowed surgeons to see broken bones before opening the skin. Electrical and later laser surgery offered precise control over bleeding. Minimally invasive techniques, using small incisions and cameras, reduced recovery times and complications. Even the tools improved. Scalpel blades became sharper and more refined. Sutures evolved from simple thread to absorbable materials. Needles were curved to better match the shape of human tissue. Surgery wasn't limited to physical tools anymore. The 21st century ushered in robot-assisted surgery. Machines like the Da Vinci surgical system allowed for incredible precision and dexterity. Surgeons sat at consoles, guiding robotic arms through procedures with a level of finesse that would astonish their 19th century counterparts. Yet for all the technology, the heart of surgery remained deeply human. It was still a test of judgment, skill, and steady hands. A moment of trust between patient and surgeon. Behind the scenes, anesthesiologists played a vital role, monitoring breathing, heart rate, consciousness, calculating drug dosages down to the milligram, responding in seconds. If something went wrong, nurses prepared tools, monitored vitals, ensured every detail was accounted for. The modern surgical team was a well-choreographed dance of cooperation and care. Of course, surgery still carries risks. Infections can happen. Bleeding must be controlled. Reactions to anesthesia must be managed. But thanks to centuries of progress, those risks are smaller than ever. Patients routinely undergo operations that once would have been fatal and walk out of the hospital a few days later. So next time you hear someone mention going in for a procedure, remember the road it took to get here. From screaming on a wooden table to drifting off under warm lights. From blood-soaked aprons to sterile gowns. From bloodletting to robotic arms. Surgery is one of the most astonishing transformations in all of medical history. And it all began with a simple question. What? If pain could be stopped and wounds could be cleaned, the answers changed everything. The pharmaceutical era, from accidental discoveries to targeted therapies. If you've ever opened your medicine cabinet and marveled at the variety of pills, capsules, ointments, sprays, drops, and tablets sitting neatly in rows, each one designed to ease a pain, lower a fever, clear a rash, or quiet a cough, you're witnessing the legacy of a truly modern miracle, the pharmaceutical era. This is the age when medicine leapt off the page and into the laboratory, when healing stopped being a matter of guesswork and started being a matter of molecules. The story of modern pharmaceuticals begins with one of the greatest breakthroughs of all time, penicillin. It was the year 1928, and a Scottish scientist named Alexander Fleming was working in his messy lab at St. Mary's Hospital in London. Fleming was studying Staphylococcus bacteria, the kind that cause boils, sore throats, and nasty infections. One day, he noticed something strange. A petri dish he'd accidentally left uncovered had developed a strange mold around its edges, and, in those areas, the bacteria had vanished. That mold turned out to be Penicillium notatum, and the substance it produced, penicillin, was the first true antibiotic. Fleming didn't know it at the time, but he had stumbled upon something that would go on to save tens of millions of lives. It would take more than a decade to turn his discovery into a usable drug. During World War II, a team of researchers in Oxford, led by Howard Florey and Ernst Chain, figured out how to purify and mass-produce penicillin. The United States government recognized its potential and worked with pharmaceutical companies to scale up production. By D-Day in 1944, penicillin was available in large enough quantities to treat wounded soldiers on the battlefield. It worked like magic. Infections that once killed quickly were now treatable with a few doses. Penicillin marked the dawn of the antibiotic age. Soon came streptomycin, the first effective treatment for tuberculosis. Then tetracyclines, sulfonamides, cephalosporins, and many more. Antibiotics revolutionized medicine. They made surgery safer, childbirth less deadly, infectious diseases far less terrifying. But the pharmaceutical revolution didn't stop with antibiotics. Scientists began developing drugs to treat high blood pressure, diabetes, epilepsy, depression, and anxiety. Every year, new compounds emerged. Drug discovery became a fast-moving racer combination of chemistry, biology, and brilliant guesswork. Researchers would identify a biological targeting enzyme, a receptor, a pathway, unscreened thousands, sometimes millions, of chemical compounds to see which ones might influence that target. Once a promising candidate was found, it would be refined, tested, and if it passed a long and difficult series of trials, approved for human use. This brings us to one of the most important and meticulous processes in all of medicine: clinical trials. Before a drug reaches your pharmacy shelf, it must undergo years of rigorous testing. It starts with preclinical studies, often in test tubes and lab animals, to determine if the drug is safe and effective. If those results are promising, the drug moves into human trials. Phase 1 involves a small group of healthy volunteers. They take the drug to assess its safety and dosage. Phase 2 expands to a larger group of people with the condition the drug is meant to treat. Does it work? Phase 3 involves an even larger group, often across multiple sites and countries, to confirm effectiveness. monitor side effects, and compare it to existing treatments. Only after successfully completing all of these stages can a drug be approved by regulatory agencies like the FDA or the MHRA. The entire process can take 10 to 15 years and cost billions of dollars, and many drugs never make it through. Some fail in early stages. Others work well, but have unacceptable side effects. It's a long, expensive, uncertain journey, but the results, when successful, can be astonishing. Some of the most celebrated pharmaceutical breakthroughs of the last century include insulin, which turned type 1 diabetes from a fatal diagnosis into a manageable condition; statins, which help lower cholesterol and reduce the risk of heart attacks and strokes; antiretroviral therapy for HIV, which transformed the virus from a death sentence into a chronic, manageable condition; vaccines for polio, HPV, and COVID-19, and of course, mental health medications, antidepressants, antipsychotics, mood stabilizers, and anti-anxiety drugs that have changed countless lives. But with all these advances came something else: a growing and powerful pharmaceutical industry. Today, pharmaceutical companies are among the most profitable in the world. They fund enormous research operations, advertise their products directly to consumers in some countries, and often set prices that spark fierce debate. On one hand, they drive innovation. On the other, they sometimes place profit above people. The tension between commercial interests and public good has grown louder, and rightly so. There's also the issue of overprescribing and polypharmacy, especially in aging populations. Some patients take 10 or more medications daily. Managing interactions and side effects becomes a major challenge. Sometimes the goal of treatment becomes less about curing and more about carefully balancing. Still, for all its complications, modern pharmacology has been a triumph of human curiosity and collaboration. The ability to identify a problem at the molecular level, design a solution, and deliver it in a tablet the size of your fingernail is nothing short of astonishing. And things are only accelerating. We're entering the era of precision medicine, where drugs are tailored not just to a condition, but to a person's unique genetic makeup. Advances in AI are speeding up drug discovery. New delivery systems like microneedle patches or slow-release implants are changing how treatments are administered. Gene editing therapies are on the horizon, offering the potential for cures, not just lifelong management. So the next time you open that medicine cabinet, take a moment to marvel at what's inside. Every pill, every bottle, every blister pack is the result of centuries of study, thousands of hours of research, and the hopes of countless scientists and patients. It's modern alchemy, not of turning lead into gold, but of turning suffering into healing, uncertainty into relief. And that is its own kind of magic. Traditional and alternative medicine, the wisdom of the past, meets the science of the present in the brightly lit halls of modern hospitals and research labs. You'll find machines that hum, charts that blink, and specialists who speak in languages that sound almost alien, full of acronyms, enzymes, and data. But just beyond those white walls in bustling street markets, serene temples, jungle villages, and quiet homes across the globe, an other world of healing unfolds. This is the world of traditional and alternative medicine, ancient, evolving, deeply rooted in culture, story, and belief. While modern biomedical medicine has taken center stage in many places, these systems of healing continue to thrive, sometimes alongside mainstream treatments, sometimes in place of them. They offer not just remedies, but a worldview, a way of understanding the body, illness, and balance that stretches back thousands of Ayurveda, originating in India. More than 3,000 years ago, views health as a dynamic balance between three energies, or doshas: vata, air and space, Pitta fire and water, and Kapha earth and water. Every individual, according to Ayurveda, has a unique combination of these doshas, governing their physical constitution, personality, and susceptibility to disease. Ayurvedic treatments focus on restoring balance through diet, yoga, breathing, exercises, herbal formulations, or detoxification therapies like pancha. Some Ayurvedic herbs like ashwagandha, turmeric, and triphala have been studied scientifically and show promise for reducing inflammation, improving mood, or supporting digestion, while some Ayurvedic practices raise safety concerns, particularly when heavy metals are involved. Many people find relief, comfort, and community in its holistic approach. Ayurveda treats the body as a living expression of the universe. Health is not just the absence of disease, a harmony between mind, body, and environment. On the other side of Asia, traditional Chinese medicine, TCM, has roots reaching back over 2,000 years, built on the idea of Qi, a vital life force flowing through the body's meridians or energy pathways. Illness arises when this flow is blocked, weak, or imbalanced. Restoring it means working with the body's energy using acupuncture, herbal medicine, tai chi, cupping, and moxibustion. Acupuncture, perhaps the most famous TCM practice, involves inserting fine needles at specific points on the body to influence the movement of qi. Though originally based on energetic theories, acupuncture has gained attention from Western researchers for its potential to reduce pain, ease nausea, and help with conditions like anxiety and insomnia. The mechanisms are still being explored, but some studies suggest acupuncture may stimulate nerves, release endorphins, or modulate brain activity. Chinese herbal medicine is also vast and nuanced. Formulas often contain several ingredients, chosen not just for their individual properties, but for how they interact with the whole. Plants like ginseng, like ore, not just herbs, rituals, relationships, and the belief that well-being is possible. Whether you're sipping ginger tea for a cold, practicing Tai Chi in the park, or reading about your dosha before choosing your lunch, or participating in a global story of healing that is rich, diverse, and ongoing. Modern medicine may dominate the headlines, but traditional and alternative medicines remind us of something profound. Healing is not just about killing germs or correcting chemistry. It's about listening, connecting, and remembering that the body is more than a machine. It's a story, a symphony, a garden. And sometimes, tending that garden means honoring the old ways, the quiet ways and the ways that may not yet fit into a chart, but still make us feel whole. So here we are, having traveled through time, across continents, through cultures, and countless human bodies in search of healing. From the skull-drilling shamans of the Stone Age to the precision-guided robotic arms of the modern operating theatre, from the ancient herbal remedies and bone drills to microscopes, vaccines, and robotic surgery. This is the science of sickness, the history of human healing, a story shaped by trial, error, courage, and the persistent hope that sickness doesn't have to mean suffering not forever. We've seen how early humans turned to herbs, spirits, and rituals, trying to make sense of pain with the tools they had. How ancient Egyptians and Greeks mapped the body with astonishing accuracy and a few amusing misconceptions. How Roman field hospitals, medieval monasteries, and plague-ridden cities shaped the course of medicine. How Renaissance dissection halls, alchemical labs, and microscope-lit rooms pushed understanding forward. How a country doctor's experiment with cowpox sparked a global revolution in immunity. How modern pharmacology transformed molecules into miracles. And now, at the end of this long, sleepy journey through the ages of medicine, I'd like to gently return to the same questions we began with. Where in the world are you listening from? What time is it for you right now? Are you nestled under the covers, eyelids heavy, letting this story drift into dreams, or are you listening during a quiet moment of rest, somewhere in the soft in-between of your day? Wherever you are and whenever this finds you, I hope this journey has brought you something useful. A new fact, a new perspective, maybe just a little comfort. If you're still awakened, this story kept your mind quietly glad. If it helped you fall asleep, then I've done my job even better. Thank you for being here. If you enjoyed this video, a like and a subscribe would mean the world. And if you'd like to share where you're listening from more the time on your clock, I always love reading your comments. This has been The Sleepy Scientist. Sleep well, stay curious, and take care.